Good morning, family. Welcome back again to the village. It's another really beautiful morning. The sun is shining, the birds are chirping. We are simply enjoying the village. Well, unfortunately, today I'm going to talk about a more somber topic, one that gives me really no joy to address, but it has come up in many of the conversations we've had in the last couple of days. Now, as I talk about this critical topic, I'm going to show you some of the initial steps of the tiling work that went on to the gazebo that we have outside. So I hope you enjoy while listening to my story, and I hope at the end of the day, this will be worth your time. If at all it is worth your time, I hope you subscribe. But in any event, even if you don't, I'm still glad you're going to spend some time with us. Now, as the topic suggests, there have been very few but notable cases of domestic violence happening within the Kenyan-American community. And unfortunately, some of them have been fatal. Now, I want to also state this earlier on that these incidences are way more common in other American communities compared to the African community. So I don't want anybody thinking that this is a Kenyan problem or this is an African problem. They are more likely to occur in other communities than they do within the Kenyan community. And unfortunately, in the majority of cases, women are more likely to be the victims, as we have observed. And so as you listen to me, as you watch this video, I hope you don't use this information to stereotype Kenyan men. Remember, the examples I'm sharing represent a very small segment of the Kenyan American community. And so this is not necessarily a sample that can be used to make a broad statement about the entire Kenyan American community. Now, some of you may ask, why are we talking about this topic and why now? So I'm going to give you three reasons. Reason number one, issues of domestic violence, particularly those that end up being fatal, absolutely deserve attention. And I think that these are conversations that are going to be incredibly important to folks who are preparing to leave Kenya for diaspora, especially couples who are in already committed relationships and are traveling to America. And also, I hope this conversation will be beneficial for young women who may end up getting into relationship with Kenyan Americans, because there's so many things that happen up here that you may not hear about until it's too late. So I hope what I'm going to share will be useful to everybody. And as I do this, I also want to be very clear on my particular position on this matter. I say that no violence is justifiable under any circumstance. My personal position is that folks can walk away even if it means walking away with nothing. So violence, it cannot be justified under whatever circumstance. So that's where I stand. So in this video, I'm going to share just two examples. There are a few others out there that you can read about, but I'm going to share two examples. And then I will explore the circumstances that are often associated with these deadly acts. Now, these circumstances are not justification. So let me be clear on that. We are not saying this to justify what happens. We are only explaining some of the patterns we've observed. And then I'll talk about the responses that happen both in our community and in the American community, and then highlight a few red flags that are particularly important to young women in these circumstances. And then lastly, I'm going to end with a list of potential safeguards that may make a difference when a person finds themselves in this circumstance. Now, those of you who watch news recently, I think maybe the last couple months, may have seen this incident of Kevin Kang'ethe, who fatally stabbed, allegedly, his girlfriend, and then stuffed her in the back of a car and then parked the car at the airport and then flew to Kenya. I believe he must have been arrested. I don't know if he's been extradited, but the U.S. authorities came for him in Kenya. There was also this case of retired banker Leonard, I believe, Mithiga, who allegedly hired hitmen to kill his wife. And you can read more about it. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's many examples, but I'm only highlighting those more recent cases. So some of the circumstances that typically are linked with these events include number one, disappointments. And I'm going to list about maybe 7 factors. Remember, these factors are not mutually exclusive, they often co occur. And so somebody should not assume that one factor is enough to explain all of what's going on. So I'm just going to list them one at a time. So the first one is disappointment. There's been quite a few cases of particularly African men or Kenyan men who travel back home, find spouses, bring them back, and in their minds, and I'll use air quotes, invest in the spouses, whether that means sponsoring their green cards, supporting them through school, and many, many things. And so when some folks feel they have quote unquote invested in a person who eventually moves on to do something else, that can often be problematic. And I've also seen a different scenario where even spouses that meet in the US and have not technically invested in each other fall apart. And then the woman, for example, moves on to another man. That can often be challenging for some folks to deal with. And so disappointments of all kinds of nature have been associated with this circumstance. The second example has to do with personality disorders. Quite a few Kenyans, just like you will find in every other community, struggle with personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, or even obsessive compulsive personality disorder. And within our Kenyan community, how we address this issue is fairly unique. So many folks, or not many, but a few folks struggle with these disorders and get no support. And in some cases, unfortunately, these disorders have been associated with domestic violence. There's also a host of other mental health challenges that occur in a community that are often not diagnosed and not addressed. But at this point, I also want to highlight that people with mental health challenges are more likely to be the victims than perpetrators of violence. And so it's not accurate to assume that people with mental health issues are the ones who are going to cause harm. Not at all true. They are more likely to be victims. And then, of course, you have this specific group of folks who have very poor coping mechanisms. So when they experience loss, the way they respond to that are often very antisocial. And in other circumstances, there are also cultural factors that explain these problems, especially patriarchy, where some of us are raised in communities where we believe that women are supposed to be treated in a certain way, often in ways that are not kind. So that often can be related to the violence that I'm talking about. And then another example also has to do with people who just have problems adjusting. On average, especially within my circle, I think it takes us men longer to adjust. And so I've seen cases where men come from home to America and hoping to relate with their spouses in the same way they did back in Kenya. And so that can potentially create very turbulent experiences. And then I think lastly, they're just folks who seem to have criminal tendencies for whatever reason. So these are some of the circumstances that I keep hearing every time something happens in a family. And so when an event occurs, whether it's domestic violence that leads to death, of course, the American authorities typically do arrest. And even in circumstances where people take off and go home, I've seen people being extradited. And then within the Kenyan community, when such a thing happens, individuals or the community sort of just stays away. And the person who has committed the offense becomes sort of like a pariah. So if you're asking about the potential red flags that a person should be keeping an eye on, I will highlight a few. The first has to do with the idea of having a grandiose sense of importance. They are people for whom the world revolves around them, and they sort of believe that if they are not there, then the world stops moving around. Now, that has its own set of problems, and I am not skilled enough to explain how that happens. But yes, I know quite a few people who struggle with that. And then there are also individuals who really have trouble with empathy. They have such a hard time putting themselves in other people's shoes, to the extent that even when they are causing harm, they are not able to self-reflect, to really empathize with the people they're harming. And this is one of the things that I don't even know if there's a way to fix that, if fixing is even a thing. And then there are folks who have a really, really deep sense of entitlement, that they just feel entitled to certain things for whatever reason, whether it's culture or they feel like they've invested, but they just feel entitled to certain things. And when they don't get that, it becomes problematic. In fact, that reminds me of a phrase that I personally really don't like. I hear it a lot in Kenya when people talk of conjugal rights. As an individual, I honestly do not believe there is any such thing as conjugal rights. What I think actually is there instead is conjugal privileges. I think people get privilege when they choose to live with each other. I don't think sex is a right. I think it's a privilege that people get. But when we raise young people thinking that when you're married, it's your right, then that may also bring up the issue of entitlement that I mentioned earlier. So just to be clear, I don't believe there's any such thing as conjugal right, even in marriage. I think it is a privilege, but we can disagree on that. Now, there's also a group of folks who are very fragile self-esteem. And whether that's a function of the environments they grew up in or whatever social circumstances they have struggled with, the low self-esteem sometimes has been associated with the need to overcompensate. And so that certainly can be a problem for people who struggle with that. And then you have these particular folks who have an intense need to manipulate or control other people's behavior. And particularly when the individuals who don't realize they're doing it have no sense of self-reflection and have no ability to control their manipulative sense, these folks can be very harmful. And then, of course, one of the patterns you'll observe is that many of these folks have significant trouble maintaining relationships in general. And I'm not even talking about love-related relationships, whether it's just friends of same gender, work relationship, they just seem to struggle in every single circumstance. So at work, they have problems. In their social circle, they have problems. In their personal circles, they have problems. Amongst their families, within their siblings, they have problems. And so you'll see this consistent pattern of struggles with relationship. That, in my view, is a big red flag. And then, of course, you have this other really common one where these individuals have the propensity to cut people off from their support system. And I suspect that when these folks cut their spouses off from their support system, they're really putting them in a position where they have total control. So again, the desire to control is actually actualized or made easier when a person is really cut off from their support system. So that's why I say if anyone is cutting you from your support system, that is somebody you want to keep an eye on. Yeah. So what are some of the potential safeguards that people should watch out for? And there are many, many examples, but the ones I'm going to share may be particularly relevant to young women who are dating Kenyan Americans or young women who have an interest in dating and potentially living with Kenyans living in the diaspora. Because I think this is a very unique group that can be vulnerable in so many ways, whether it is financial, social, and in a variety of reasons. And so these are some safeguards that I think folks can put in place that may make a difference. So the first safeguard is we encourage folks to really, really take their time before moving to the US. Unfortunately, sometimes spouses are so much enamored with the idea of moving to the US where they tend to ignore red flags. So if at all possible, please take your time, and as you do that, spend that time wisely doing your homework. And the homework here is more about background check. Find out these individuals' relationships, friendships, siblings, or even their reputation within the Kenyan-American community. Yes, the US as a country is very big, but the Kenyan-American community is so small that you'd be surprised how much we know of each other, even amongst folks who live in different states. So do your background check. Then number three, super important, make sure you minimize your dependence on your potential spouse or spouse, especially financial dependence and social dependence. Because when you're totally financially dependent on your spouse, then that becomes a big control tool that can be pulled left and right to control folks. And socially, I've seen cases where young women move over, and because they have no networks, their spouse's friends becomes their friends. Now, that's fine in many cases, but folks are encouraged to develop their own friendship network so that in case something goes wrong, you don't have to depend on your spouse's friend to get by, especially when the spouse is the one that is causing harm. Now, the next potential safeguard is about maintaining a support system. Make sure you have at least one or two folks who you can call at 3 a.m. and will return your call. Never cut yourself off completely. And that also means have someone with whom you can bounce off ideas. And I'm not talking about looking for somebody to agree with you. Have somebody who can sit you down and tell you when you are wrong. Sometimes we look for people who disagree with us. And then it's okay to seek professional help, whether it means counseling, psychological support. It is okay to seek professional help. And the last one, run if you must, especially where there's violence. Run. Well, I hope this was useful, and I'll see you in the next. Thank you.